Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Constructive Criticism Podcast. I'm your host, Easy. I'm joined by a man with a different colored beanie today, Abe Stein.
I think I wore this beanie, maybe it's just been on episodes with Mason that I'm wearing this beanie. I try to alternate, or at least not, the red beanie, it's got to get some...
It's got to get washed eventually. It's got to spend some time in the washing machine. Speaking of Mason, we have the king of coverage on as well, Mason Clark.
Hey, how y'all doing?
You tired? Was that a lot of coverage?
Yeah, I commentated every round of the Canadian RC. I worked every day before that. I'm working every day this weekend. I'm commentating the NRG this weekend. I'm working every day next week. Then I'm commentating the RC.
It's so much.
I'm working 26 days in a row.
Is it fun?
And how many of those days are preview season, Mason?
A majority of them were. It's almost over, though. It's this Friday, or this Thursday it ends, I think.
Wrong answer. Preview season's never over.
I was watching, we'll get into this actually during the episode, but I was watching an Andre Emmett YouTube video where people asked him about preview season. He's like, is that a season now? I think that's just a thing that exists every day. I thought it was funny. We are going to dive right in, though, this week. We are talking about modern power rankings. We had 3 different RCs. We had Prague, Brazil, and I actually don't know what side of Canada this was. Oh, it was Ottawa. That's I do know. And Ottawa this weekend, giving us quite a bit of data before the regional championship in Portland. And we are going to do a power ranking style episode. For those who don't know, these are the type of episodes where we award points according to finish. But we actually have a new point system. Mason, this was your idea, so I wanted to give you a chance to kind of talk about what the new point system is and why we're doing it.
Yeah, so I mean, Frank Carson came up with a point system a long time ago that honestly only we ever use. No one else does. And it's kind of confusing personally. And I think that there is some benefit to more points to first and a little bit less to second and down the chain. But it really just ends up being sort of a thing where sometimes a deck gets one first in a top 8, and then it's in our top 8 if the format's really wide. And it's not really representative. But more importantly, we should be talking about what are people playing and what does the format look like, and also a little bit of how they're performing. So we're going to try iterating on the process a little bit, right? Like in Magic, a lot of the reason the game's so cool is because it iterates. So we're going to try iterating on what Frank did. And basically, we've changed it to where I believe it was top 8 gets 3 points, 9th through 16 gets 2, and 17th through 32nd get 1, with the idea being that this will give you a bit more idea of, where things are at, and, still have a representation about how much a deck is played and how well it is doing, with it not being so top heavy. As personally, I am a big believer the difference between first and second and first and fourth is actually not that big and should not reflect accordingly. That's me opinion. But yeah, this is trying to help to maybe smooth that over, and I'm sure we'll iterate on it and improve with time.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. We've already talked about the events that are included. I only had the time that I had to put these together, and there were 2 top 8 lists missing. I believe it was from the Brazil data. So they're not represented. So if you're a patron and you're looking at the spreadsheet, you're like, well, there's 2 top 8 decks missing. That is because MTG Melee didn't have the decks. That's the reason. With that, let's talk about the data first. We got data from the 430 entrants of the Canadian RC, and we got conversion rates. And I wanted to kind of quickly go over interesting things that I found from them. The highest converted deck of decks that made up, a big enough part of the metagame to talk about was what I found really interesting. Orzhov Blink came in with a 35% conversion rate in Ontario, or Ottawa, sorry. And Emulate Titan came in with 33.3. And those seem kind of high to me. I don't know, if you guys have any thoughts on that, but going into these events, to me, there was a clear delineation, and I think you had talked about this on the Patreon only episode, of the top 4 decks, and these were not mentioned in that.
Yeah, I mean, those decks are also, were some of the least represented decks in the field. I mean, they both had, I think 20 and 21 players, respectively. So, those percentages are high when they have, 6 or 7 players converting. And I think also the people who make those choices, like with Amulet Titan, there's a lot of people who especially play Amulet Titan, and might just have a bit of an experience edge. On the format of that. And the Orzhov deck, I mean, that deck is definitely one of the newest decks to really crop up. And so I'm not very surprised to see that have a bit of success there on day one, especially where some people might not have had the experience playing against it they would against some of the other stock decks, even if it didn't have maybe monster finishes that you might expect from a deck performing like that, but
Yeah, sorry about interrupting there. I thought you were done. But yeah, I mean, Amulet is just a really powerful deck. I mean, one of these players was Dom Harvey, who represents half the points gained for the deck. So Dom's gonna play Amulet no matter what, for the most part, and he plays it really well. And you can watch some of that on the coverage for the face-to-face thing. But that represents a good chunk of the points there. And I think it's hard for Amulet to be so bad. And it has a lot of really powerful sideboard cards in the format right now. I think Force of Vigor is very strong. It has also it kind of cares about some different things than the other decks are, which makes it pretty appealing. It's also like a 4 Boseiju deck, which is hard sometimes for the Breach decks to stop. Even if they go in on the Orm Champ builds, which is kind of okay, I'm going to go off, you can't stop me, hee options. Boseiju gets around that, right? So it has a lot of game against that kind of stuff, while also just being able to overpower the Boros decks a fair amount. So I think that makes sense, and I imagine it's probably maybe a little favored versus Eldrazi and a little coin flippy at worst. Maybe play draw matters a lot, but it's just powerful. It does kind of crumble sometimes under its own weight of cumbersomeness, but I don't know. And then for the Orzhov deck, I've actually been really impressed by the Orzhov deck. I think the deck got second at the RC, and I would argue that maybe the 3-hour marathon of back-to-back Boros games actually led the player to making a fatal error on the last turn. I don't know if they would have won, but the game would have been a lot closer. And so it's just a position where it's this deck is really, in my mind, shot up the rankings. I think it's better than Oculus, just to lead a little bit on the listeners. And, the thing that really made it all click for me is that it is not a taxes deck. And in my mind, for what it's worth, when I say taxes, I think creature-based control. That is how I kind of view taxes, using lockout pieces and things like that. This really is just a control deck. And it's using these creatures in that way. But that delineation of okay, I need to have these hate bears. You don't need things like that. And you don't need to rush to win. You can really take a long time and still close the door. And once that clicked, and once I saw that on coverage, my win rate with the deck has shot up a good bit. And I was already pretty impressed before all of this. And that one mental change really put me much, much higher on the deck. So I'm not surprised. And I think a lot of people were smart enough to pick it up and play it that way. And those people, I think, got rewarded pretty heavily this past weekend, as people were not respecting the deck before here.
Yeah, I think that, what Abe, you said about getting some equity on it being the new kid on the block is definitely true. But I also think that the deck is attacking the format from this very mid-rangey controlling angle that it a lot of other decks aren't doing, and if they are doing it, they're not doing it very well. And yeah, I think that that's reflected in the data. You mentioned Demir, specifically Oculus Mason, and the opinions about this deck vary wildly. And then the data between events also varies wildly between the 3 events for the deck. And I'm kind of curious if you guys, before we move on, it did fine in Canada. It did horrible in Prague. legitimately terrible. And I'm curious why we think that is.
I personally think the deck is. So I guess I should say this. I thought the deck was a little bit better at fighting the combo and the big mana decks than I think it is in reality. And so I felt like, okay, it has like these pretty good tools to break these decks up. It has a good clock. It's, with the Oculus innovation, even going way faster than, like the Burktide decks of old when it comes to killing your opponent. And so I kind of valued those things pretty highly. And as such was like higher on the deck. After playing more and seeing people play and just watch how, like, if you want to beat that deck, you kind of can. And a lot of times it just involves like not playing into their game plan and like really learning the matchup and seeing people sort of execute on that versus the deck, along with just like some smart sideboard inclusions or like pivots from other players. To me, I think that's part of why Dimir Oculus didn't do very well. And I also think it's kind of a low agency deck, which is very funny because Oculus players like to think the deck is high agency, but they kind of just have their cards. They only do the very few things that they have. They have some cantrips, which makes them feel sort of like a lot of control, but they sort of are just like, okay, I can only really answer the few things I can. Counterspell's kind of been, phased out of the format in this context. And like, the cards are too mana efficient to really fight through Counterspell. You're siding it out most of the time. And players abuse that fact, and your deck just kind of like gets dog walked by most players who are competent. And, like, I kind of thought maybe my experience versus Oculus was like, okay, they could have played that a little better, or maybe they have some options. It's a really hard deck, or like maybe there's some innovations. And after this past weekend, my opinion on the deck from like the bottom of the good decks is now to like it is in like the tier 2-ish range of power in my mind. And I think you could theoretically do things to fix some of this. Like I know some players like Namor Squats on Magic Online have done very well cutting Counterspell and moving the deck in a direction that answers some of these issues. But I think I kind of need to see the proof and like the consistency from other players who are like more decks evolving in that direction for me to feel kind of differently. Not to say the deck's horrible where it's like some awful deck. It's really fallen down the rankings from like a top dog to me to like a fine good deck.
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about the deck in the power rankings too, but I think that a lot of what you just said, Mason, is really accurate. And I think that there's a real issue with the deck where it's kind of suffering from its own identity crisis of like having these cards that support a plan, things like Oculus, and especially like really leaning into the unearthed stuff. But that plan not really stacking up well against what people are doing in the format. It's kind of hard to have a deck where all of your best threats are 2 or 3 mana and require a little bit of setup. In a world where like the best opposing fair deck and even the unfair decks are all like cheating on mana and playing a bunch of 1-drops. So it finds itself in a pretty tough pinch. And I mean, like you said, there's not really an agreement among the hive mind of like what the best way to do things is. Namor Squad's playing a bunch of 1-drop, interaction did have a really good result. I think split the finals of the Super Qualifier online with Breach, but at the same time, the sacrifice of Counterspell there isn't free. And I think that especially when you start to see like an open decklist tournament, if you try to do something like that, I mean, you would just become more and more exploitable the less that you're playing cards that make your game matter. So if people don't play into what you're trying to do, I think Frog doesn't have a lot of tools there because really it's not this like you said, Base. It's not really a high agency kind of game plan deck. It really is a tempo deck at this point, right? It's trying to protect a threat and ride it to victory. Be that Psychic Frog drawing them cards or Oculus just taking over the game on its own. It's really leaning on the strength of its threats above any of its, selection, card advantage, or answers. So if that's the way the game plays out, which I think a lot of people have started to understand about playing against that deck, of, if I can just prevent them from really ever getting ahead with their creatures, then I'm not really as scared of them because they don't have many ways to like bury me in anything. And even when they do, it's like maybe they can get up a card or two off of Psychic Frog. But if it's already to the mid game and I've kind of gotten myself established, I'm casting spells that matter, maybe pound for pound, I'm kind of hanging in there. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to see that deck go from something I know when the unbans happened, even it was like, oh, this is going to be one of the best decks still. But yeah, it's definitely fallen from grace. I think that this weekend really marked kind of the end of Frog, unless it sees a big facelift as far as like the number one decks in the metagame.
Let's not bury the lead. I do want to get into the power rankings, and I'm just going to read the 8 decks that normally I would do 8 decks. This one actually is technically 9 decks, but there were not a lot of decks that did super well, and I want to be upfront about that. So with 4 points, there are 2 decks: Rhinos and Zoo. Not much to say. At 6 points, these are ranked according to, I believe, number of finishes, which actually might be wrong. I believe I'm supposed to do best finish. Anyway, at 6 points, you have Amulet and Belcher. I believe that it was 3 points from Dom and 2 top 32s, or a top 30, a top 16, and a top 32. And then Belcher got all of its points, I believe, from 4 top 32s. Demir comes in with 10 points. Probably the worst finish for a deck as represented as Belcher, or as Demir was. Worst off comes in with 14 points in 4th place. Eldrazi Ramp comes in with 27 points. I combined all Eldrazi versions for this. This means the Izzet version that top 32'd, the Gruul versions that did well, and the Teamer versions are all together. I can
just to be clear, when we say Izzet, you do not mean Through the Breach. You're talking about the core of like, I'm a big mana Emrakul the Promised End deck,
correct,
just for
yes.
listeners at home.
Yep.
Yeah. We're not combining Through the Breach here. Just wanted to make that clear.
Yep.
Because I was confused the first time I read it. Continue.
Yep. And then Breach Combo comes in with 36 points. All of these are combined. I don't think there's even possibly a way to delineate the number of variations that this
4 color versus 3 color
just
versus
like,
2 color.
I didn't even try. Boros comes in with 39 points at number 1. This does not include the one Mardu deck that top 32'd. I think that it is very clear from the data and from what we're seeing that Boros is the correct choice over Mardu, just based upon results. And that's the power rankings. I don't know. I'm gonna start somewhere because I got pressed both by my teammates and somebody that was coaching on where I thought the format standed from initial glances. And I think that I was pretty close to spot on with this format. I didn't get to join you guys on the podcast last week, but I am not surprised. I think that Amulet overperformed because it's constantly doing that. I think that people, Mason says this every time, but like, we just need to be less scared to pick up this deck. I think that it is one of the fastest, best unfair decks in this format, and does not get the respect that it deserves constantly. I don't know why. I think Belcher, when I was looking at numbers, looked like it was underperforming to me. I don't know if it's... I would lay your... Is it just too slow? Like, I'm kind of curious your guys' thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the Belcher deck has some pretty glaring weaknesses in the sense that a lot of the format does things that go and like presents problems for Belcher that aren't just winning on the stack.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was a point in time where a lot of the games were either like a complete drag race, wherein I think Belcher had a good chance, and it was a lot of combo v combo. So like with the One Ring especially, combo v combo, where then Belcher gets the advantage of I'm a combo deck with a bunch of counter spells, which is really helpful. But now there's less of that. The decks have more hate, and also there's another like artifact combo deck that kind of catches some of the same hate. Like people playing in Eldrazi, like cards like Karn present, roadblocks for the Belcher deck. And in general, while Belcher is really consistent, and I do think it's a pretty good choice. If you're looking for a combo deck that isn't Breach, I think there's a lot of boons to the deck, and the deck is certainly playable. It just the conditions of the format have not enabled it to be as good as maybe it once was. I think that the more the format slows down and has less like hard hate pieces or lock pieces, and the more they're trying to fight on the stack with combo, the better that Belcher's going to get. But for now, that just hasn't really been the case. You kind of need to fight over a lot of things throughout the course of the game, and it's not very good at doing that. I don't know, Mason, if you have any thoughts on Blue Belcher.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's nice about Blue Belcher is, well, there's a lot of things, but the biggest one that like kind of first drew people in was, ooh, I am a combo deck that has interaction, right? And so I beat the other combo decks. That was kind of, I would argue, like the sales pitch for a lot of people. And back when Energy, it was like Energy versus combo decks during the One Ring time, that was like a pretty good place to be, right? Your opponent like tries to have over the One Ring, you get them, or you just don't even really care, and then you kill them on the next turn. That was like a practical place. And then you're playing other combo mirrors, so you're the one with interaction, Pog, right? I think it was like kind of that simple. The format's really widened up a bit since then, and I think also people have gotten a bit better at understanding and targeting the Belcher deck. So like even though it widened up, some players are doing things like White Orchid Phantom in the Energy deck instead of Sharmaw, to help have a little game against something like this, right? A little worse in one, a little better here. And people are doing things of that nature where they started to near the end of Belcher, but weren't doing it during its, like, I would say, peak. And I think that combined with the Belcher deck being like very inherently powerful, it just does turn 4 kill in Modern, really got people to play the deck. I do think it's a situation of you're playing a worse version of another deck, where everything we just described can sort of be talked about for the Breach deck. And that, in my mind, is sort of like why we're seeing these decks falter, because one, people have wisened up. You could also argue that like not only have they wisened up, but some of the Breach hate hits them too. And so they went from being this like kind of, hey, I'm 1 of 5 combo decks, you can't fight us all, hee hee, and you have to beat Energy with the One Ring, haha. To, okay, I'm one of the actual better combo decks. The hate overlaps with me a bit. Oh God, I actually play a bunch of tap lands sometimes and stumble, and the format's sped up a little in that regard. And there's another combo deck that's doing what I'm trying to do. So that's a lot of my thoughts on it. I'll say this,
sorry.
I was going to say really quickly, much like Oculus, I think Belcher is probably in my mind one of the good decks, not the great decks, right? I think it's probably on the lower end of that right now. I think that's something that will change up a lot with time. But yeah, that's kind of where I am on the deck. Spencer, you have something you want to say?
Well, I think you just kind of hit the point that I wanted to hit. It's like the format's kind of sped up because it was forced to in a lot of ways. And it kind of started this conversation like, is it too slow? Like, straight up, it's just Belcher too slow for the format right now. And world in which your interaction is really good, it doesn't really matter on the turn that you combo off, right? Because you've successfully stopped your opponent from interacting with you and also executing their game plan. But in a format where that doesn't work, then you have to be pretty fast so that they have to then adjust to your game plan. But that's not what happens with Belcher in this format. And I think that you really did a good job of highlighting like why that's true. So, I like I said, I don't want to, like I said before, I don't want to bury the lead on this. We've talked about Demir quite a bit already. I will just say my thoughts because I didn't. I think the deck is fine. Like, people love their, I mean, including me, I'm guilty of this too, like their hyperbolic takes. And the deck's fine. Like, I think that the thing is, when you get to something like the RC, the skill diff that a lot of people were experiencing with the deck disappears. Especially when you hit like the later rounds, and it shows in the results. Like, it didn't have the later round results that result in points for the way that we view points. And I just think that like the agency thing is true, and it compounds it when it's a known quantity that people know how to play against because it was one of the best 4 decks going in. And I don't know, like I think that it's fine. Like, but I think that, like, for example, I think that I would expect that they played against a lot of ley lines in the early rounds that they were not prepared to beat, and I think that it probably hurt them quite a bit.
What do you mean ley lines?
Ley line of the Void. If you look at like the top 64, Leyline of the Void was pretty present in sideboards to try and fight Breach, even if it didn't convert into the final rounds.
I see. It's getting kind of splashgated by some bad Breach plans.
Yep, exactly. Where it's like, it's not just bad Breach, it's just people trying to have sideboard cards for multiple matchups, right?
I guess. I guess it's just this deck and that of the known top decks, right? But yeah, that's fair. I mean, that is reasonable. Leyline of the Void is not like a weak card by any means. So
I was just looking at, maybe it was just one of the events, but I noticed Leyline of the Void was a popular top 64 card.
Sure.
I'll post that in the Discord. I looked at way too many lists.
I think also, like, I don't know what your guys' experience is playing against Frog, but I think that, like, the amount of players who I know who would pull the trigger on, like, their first turn attacking with a Frog and knowing it's going to connect, of, like, discarding 2 cards to understand that, like, okay, this is what the game is about now, and this is what we're playing. I honestly, at the RC level, I think is, like, 2 in the room. Like there's no, like, people don't think like that unless they've played a lot of decks like that. And if you're not doing that with Frog, you actually have no shot, because you have to just trust that you're all in and that you're, like, protecting this thing, because if you don't deal the damage,
you gotta be like you gotta be a poker player to play this deck.
Well,
you can't win the game. You just can't win the game if you're just, like, sitting there attacking for 2,
I love it.
attacking for 1 or 2 every turn.
No,
and no Frog players I play against online ever do this, but every time I play against Frog, and I'm like, man, like, I mean, I guess I'm gonna mind twist them for 3 here with, like, galvanic discharge, or, like, you know, like, hopefully they don't just commit, because this is my whole plan.
One of my teammates is really high on this deck, and, like, he has, like, a sideboard guide written out that we have, like, a spreadsheet on, and that I think he has a top 8 and 2 top 16s already with the deck, and Quentin, former host of the show. And watching him play the deck, he makes so many different plays than I would make. I'm like, this is experience. Like, you know this deck. And it's funny because I watched Andre Mangucci talk about how good he thinks this deck is. And then he still played Boros at the event. So I don't know how good he really thinks it is.
Yeah. Really quickly, back on Ape's point, I think he's 100% right. I tell people in coaching with the Frog deck that you need to discard a card the first time the card's going to connect, minimum 1 card. And I'll be like, if you are not unless your hand is all unbeatable spells that they can never beat, if there's a land in there or some random BS card, the rules actually say you have to discard, because hitting them for 1 is not enough. Like, we need to end the game. We can't actually stop everything. You have to put a clock on them. And I reviewed somebody, I told them that, and then A week later, we watched another game and they didn't do it. And I was like, in the review, like you messed up right here. This is like a fundamental rule. You have 4 lands in your hand. What are you doing? You know, and that's just like Abe's 100% right. You have to be willing to like discard things like that, or no, too. Like I played the deck once at an RCQ, and my opponent tribal flamed it on turn 2. I'm on the draw, and I mulliganed. I discarded my entire hand. My hand was not very good cards for that matchup. I didn't know what I was playing against, and I just went all in on the frog. I was like, I'm not going to win with any of these cards. Discard 4, you know, like, and go in. And you have to be willing to do stuff like that with the frog deck. And even when you do, you're just like not even that great. You know, you're like a good deck, but you're not like over the moon. You went into the matrix, you've come out of the other end, and it's like, God, what if you had done that for Breach? Anyways,
at least you could jump it twice. I don't know.
That's true. Yeah, my problem was jumping. I was fetching 2 in the early turns. I met a Draco in the air, and I was like, "Who's coming out on top, buddy?"
Yeah, I did really want to address just what I think is like a real fundamental misunderstanding with people who pick up that deck as to how it's supposed to play, and I would not be surprised if, you know, if we saw frog numbers decline as a result of this weekend's results, if there wasn't a bit of a rebound of like the true frog knowers and enjoyers to bring it back now that you have just the people who know what they're doing with the deck playing, and as people kind of stop respecting it.
I think that like this is a deck that I almost committed to, for what it's worth, because I have a known expert on my team, and the amount that like I initially thought it was, is it Murktide, and then it's not, is it Murktide, was so much. Like, that's not it at all. Like, it's a protect the queen deck, not a like.
Yeah, because Bowmasters is like not a card you're looking to register in your main deck often anymore. Like, you really do not have that other kind of like grindier game plan. You are very much tempo deck with that deck.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else really we want to say about Frog. I did want to talk a little bit about obviously I think we've said a lot of words about, like, on the show about Boros and about Breach. I definitely alluded to them being like some of the best decks. I kind of want to talk a little bit about like the Boros, Breach, Eldrazi, and I guess now Orzhov, kind of like 4 corners of the universe going on.
You mean the mid range, the ramp, the combo, and the aggro deck that somehow ended up as the top 4 decks?
Well, I mean, I think it's not necessarily that simple. I think there's a couple things going on. I think that Breach, like, there's a bunch of really messed up cards in the format, right? I think Breach is the best Mox Opal deck. I think Eldrazi is the best Ugin's Labyrinth deck. And then I think Boros is just like the best every other card in MH3 deck, right? Like, all of it's really Flayed, just like the biggest thing, but just like every threat that is probably a mana less than like it could have been and still been roughly playable, that's just in the format. All of those things present like the hyper efficient side of the format. And I think Orzhov really, like you were saying, Mason, it's not so much of like another form of creature, like aggressive mid-range deck. It's actually an inevitability deck, because the games that like need grinding are so pinpoint down to like 1 or 2 cards advantage, or like Flay just like the biggest thing people are doing to go over the top of others. Like, if you do something else to accomplish that, like, it's the only deck that has a form of inevitability and a fair game plan that isn't Flage, which I think makes it pretty unique. But like the other 3 decks in the format all have these draws that just create disproportionate advantage really early on, right? Like, I mean, I was talking about this in Discord with someone recently, that like Eldrazi has turn 1 Labyrinth and like turn 1 Labyrinth, Talisman, turn 2 like Karn, or like Micah Spawn and we're off the races, or turn 1 Utopia Sprawl, turn 2 Labyrinth Imprint, cast a Karn or another 4-drop. Like, those draws are pretty unbeatable.
It's so funny that you say that because, like, you guys talked about this on the Patreon episode of like how I was like into big mana decks. I hated Eldrazi before the Karn introduction, and the second that I played a turn 2 Karn, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess this is a thing that we're gonna try to do now because like and other decks are trying to do it too. It's not just that deck. Like other decks are like, oh, we can turn 2 Karn. Like, that is a viable strategy in this format. We don't see it in these power rings, but anyway, I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, and I think that, like, that draw is... I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it's what the deck is built to be able to have a nut draw like that. And it generates just that much mana. Like, if you're on the play, and any of your hands, even if you don't have Karn on turn 2, right? But if you're starting on, like, Labyrinth, Imprint, Talisman, or you know that on turn 2 you're going to have 4 mana, like, if you're on the play, you started the game twice over before your opponent. You're supposed to go like fetch land, go, and you're gonna have 4 mana. Like that is ridiculous when you think about how powerful that is. And similarly, like Breach has draws where they have like Mox Opal, Mox Amber, Mishra's Bauble, a land, and then like a Tameo, and that Tameo is effectively free except the Amber. And now, like, both these decks have really explosive mana advantages that I think outpace just about anything else in the format. And that really leaves like Boros to be able to try to contend with a bunch of hyper efficient hate pieces, as well as hyper efficient threats. And then Orzhov to kind of be able to play a package of the right things to try to contend, and to the cost of having all of these mana generation like engines going on. Those decks are not necessarily effective at doing things that beat the kind of inevitability that that the like Orzhov deck can build. Like they're doing things that are more powerful than Boros, but they're not like generating a huge amount of resources, with the exception of like Emrakul out of Eldrazi. Like those are games that I'm sure Orzhov can't win.
So I've actually played that matchup quite a bit, and I'm gonna just put my foot down and say that it's a really good matchup for Eldrazi. I've also talked to my Orzhov opponents in leagues about this. They feel the same way. They're like, if I dodge Eldrazi, I think that like this is one of the best decks in the format. But additionally, like I don't even think we're getting to the crux of like some of the key things that all of these decks have, which was kind of your starting point. I think that they're all playing some of the like legit best cards in Modern. I think Ocelot Pride is like one of the best cards in Modern. I think that Mox Opal, one of the best cards in Modern. I think that or Underworld Breach. We don't even need to go to Mox Opal. We just go to Underworld Breach. And I think that Kozilek's Command, while not as pop off a clock as Underworld Breach, is the actual best card in Modern. That is the only reason this deck could possibly exist. And then I think that oh my gosh, what's the pupper's name? I forgot the pupper's name.
It's Felia.
Felia, thank you. I think Felia is like just completely busted, and I think that is the thing that is putting these decks over the top, is that their card quality is so high.
Did you have something to say to that, Mason?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. I think that's also just true of lots of formats in general. I think Modern's been that way a few times in the past, of like, there are these like X number of decks. They play a lot of the best X thing in class, and they push you in a lot of different directions, and that's tough, right? Like the cards you play for your Eldrazi matchup do not line up particularly well against your Energy or your Breach or your Orzhov. And to varying degrees, some other cards might, like Wrath the Skies is pretty good against Energy and is like, passable against parts of the Breach plan. But I think that like one of the big things about Modern, I was curious for Abe to finish sort of where he was coming from at the beginning of this when it came to everything. But my view on it is like Modern is in a really challenging position to attack, because all of the perceived best decks even if you count Oculus up there, are doing such different things so well. And they are also playing cards already to protect them and insulate themselves from a lot of what people are doing. That it seems to me that strategies need to be what you're switching towards, not sideboard cards. Where sometimes in modern, it's sideboards that need to change. I think this is like a strategic level shift personally, but I'd be curious what y'all think about that.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting. Before we were talking about how there's like you were talking about Belcher and how the format is kind of spread out. I think it's really interesting to say it's spread out about a deck that is effectively like a 4 core pillar art like format in my mind of like there's really just this set of most powerful things going on that are in their class of their own in terms of quality. And while it like they just cover such a wide swath of what you can do in Magic, right? You've got decks that are turboing out threats that are really outsized comparatively, or turboing out a combo, or like the fact the Eldrazi deck gets to play Kozilek's Command and Kozilek's Return, right, means that it kind of can act as a control deck and just like sweep the board a bunch of times and ride one threat to victory. The dynamism of the gameplay that you can experience from even just these like 4 to 5 or 6 best decks makes it, like you said, really hard to attack on a level that is just adjusting a couple of cards or like in an existing archetype, because there's not really that parity across archetypes, which says that, well, if I come with this strategy and these tools to cover these blind spots in this very many different decks doing strong things in different ways, maybe some of the same strong things in different ways, so I can kind of attack the graveyard, like during the Faithless Looting format, where you could like play a bunch of graveyard hate and fight over Arclight Phoenix and like Hollow One's value, things like that, dredge. Like, okay, if I play a bunch of ley lines, maybe I have a better chance now. It's not really the case, because the ways that are being like people are doing powerful things are so different from each other, and also are so isolated into these archetypes. There's not really like, at least without doing a lot of work, like building something from ground up, there's not a lot of room to kind of wiggle from where a lot of the decks are at. And I think that's why we see Boros continue to be the most played deck, because people feel not only most comfortable playing, but also most confident that it won't be a bad decision on a given weekend. And also it continues to put up some of the best results because it does have game against all of these decks. It might not be the actual best deck in the format, and that might be Breach, that might be Eldrazi, it could be Boros, it could be Orzhov. It's too soon to tell, really, with only one big weekend's worth of results coming in. We'll kind of see how that evolves, but it's like that Boros deck is going to be in those no matter what, and it's going to be the hardest to exploit, and it's going to play the most familiarly and have the most tools, so you never really get caught feeling wrong with the choice you make. But that also kind of limits, it shows the limitations of the format right now, with kind of these huge disparities in power between the best options and the second best options. When you talk about things like, if I want to play a big mana deck, I'm either playing Tron, where I'll have like Tron on turn 3 maybe some of the times, or I can just do the really broken stuff and have 3 or 4 mana on turn 2, or like 5 mana on turn 3 pretty consistently, and just power out stuff, and that'll be pretty good. I'll get to play Kozilek's Command, so I have a bit of grease in the wheels and a good interactive spell. Or you can go and play, you can go play Breach and say, I'm like this very effective combo deck that also plays interaction. There's a lot of options, but there's not a lot of room for like a second best option to contend to become better. I think with the way things are, you're not going to find a much better Mox Opal deck than the deck that is playing as many Moxen as you'd find in like a vintage deck, between Opal and Amber, and a combo that costs you like 4 mana to execute over, like, and can be spread out over multiple turns. Like, that is an insane power level to try to replicate with another strategy. Same thing with Eldrazi. You're not going to find things that are going to be better at that. And with Boros, you're not really finding things that are going to be more efficient than playing Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride. You're not even playing Fort Ragavan, right?
Have
like
you guys
you're
Yeah,
just the most efficient things in Fort Flage.
Yeah.
Really quickly, I do want to push back a little bit on one part of it, because I think what Abe just said is very, very true for the most part. And I think there's even another level that he didn't mention, which is like, even if you figure something out for those four, the rest of the format, which lots of people play, are all doing still very powerful things, right? Like these top four are a cut above, but if you look at the decks below it, like, like look at Yogg and Ruby Storm, and you could argue Amulet and Zoo and all these other things. They are killing you and are very efficient and fight in different ways. So it's a really hard puzzle. So the one thing I will say is we are seeing a moment, though, that gives me a little bit of hope in the form of Orzhov. Orzhov wasn't a thing a little bit ago and has risen up and shows. I mean, Theo put a lot of, I don't know the full story, but it seems like Theo Jung put a lot of work in the original build and kind of got here. And that shows that it is doable, but it is really hard. And so I think it is something that is incredibly challenging. And, I think for every Orzhov, control deck, there's 1,000 failures. But I do think it is maybe possible. It's just the format is so early and these pressures are so extreme and people don't put a lot of work in. And I think personally, part of the reason Orzhov is seeing a lot of innovations is that one is a very cool and fun looking deck. And that really got people interested. I mean, Theo won the first challenge. He tweeted, "Don't play this deck." He was not that big a believer in it. But players kind of liked the engine, thought it was strong, and like ran with it. So I think that, we might see some stuff pop up. I am surprised how little things did pop up in like the outliers. We saw some decks make kind of deepish runs in certain spots, but for the most part, people did not overcome these hurdles in a real way, which maybe means they can't really, right? Like, I don't want to make it seem like there's some diamond in the rough and you spend 50,000 hours testing, you'll get there between y'all. But it is something that, like, I think could be there because we are experiencing one of these decks that was not here 4 weeks ago.
Can I interest you?
Oh, definitely.
Can I interest you in a Nykthos, Mason? Maybe a
No.
No. Fun fact, me either. But
but no, Mason. I think I 100% agree with you. I think if anything, kind of seeing a weekend like this for the start of the RC season really solidifies, like, coming into this was a question of what will it look like. Now we kind of know what it does look like, and my commentary there on kind of the starkly high power level of these things, right? These are pointing to the most immediate and obvious strong things you can do in the format. Ugin's Labyrinth is obviously strong. Like, Soul Lands are obviously strong. Cheating on mana is obviously strong. The Boros deck was obviously strong. Just because those things have remained the top of the format does not mean they will be that way forever. It doesn't mean they have to be. They could be. Those things could outclass them. But there are so many powerful cards that are in Modern Horizons 3 and Modern Horizons 2, even Modern Horizons 1. There are just lots of very powerful cards in Magic that don't have the kind of time dedicated and haven't seen like their time in the sun yet amidst everything else. And I agree with you that there's still opportunity. It is just something that takes a lot of work. And I think, if anything, starting to see like the format take shape in this 3 to 4 pillars, like we see in the power rankings here, of like if the top 3 decks remain Boros, Breach, and Eldrazi, and that takes up 40% of any room you're in. Right, let's just say that 40% feels like a fair number for the top 3 decks in a format like Modern at an RC level. I don't know if that rings true for you, but the other 60% still matters and still presents constraints. But you start to have something you can hone in on and focus on, what of this am I trying to exploit and kind of gain value off. I think the Eldrazi deck and its development to be one of these contender decks is proof of that, because before they started to, adopt Null Drifter to trigger their Kozilek's commands more often, or Kozilek's returns more often, or they adopted Karn to try to put another speed bump in front of Breach, the deck did not perform as well. There are ways that these things can adapt and the powerful decks can develop to kind of push their way through more headway, and seeing a defined metagame in front of them, I think is gonna be a really, really good way for that. So that's kind of my feelings on the whole thing. And I think if you look at like Rhinos and Zoo as our rounding out the 8A and 8B there in the power rankings, like that shows that some of the most powerful things people used to be doing of let me just put a lot of power into play quickly and kind of back it up, that's still a winning game plan some amount of the time, and one that I think if you asked any of us before the weekend if we thought Rhinos or Zoo would have like shown up on the power rankings, those were decks I hadn't even thought about or heard people think about playing.
I actually thought they were pretty interesting and pretty well positioned theoretically, and I actually wanted to talk about them. We kind of skipped over them, but I like the idea of people playing like clock plus disruption, right? Like getting big threats down and trying to run people over. I think in practice they're not quite good enough, but it makes a lot of sense that like Zoo and Rhinos would be powerful against Breach and Boros, and the non like I off-flop pride it's flood the board, you cannot get through me. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing is strong and like seems sort of good too against Eldrazi of like, I'm going to kill you quickly. I think there's a lot of holes in it, but I do think these were decks that like I was looking at and trying to learn for coverage because I thought there's a real chance that like Zoo or Rhinos could make a deep run at one of these events. And so seeing it have a deep run was pretty validating in the sense of like, there are things you can do. When I played them, they didn't feel good enough to like actually compete consistently, but also I'm not putting time in to solve problems.
I don't know, like we're kind of jumping around a bit, but I really want to talk about something you said about Breach and the mana, because the number of screenshots that I personally have had sent to me for this deck where it's like, is like, do I try to win turn 1 or 2 with this deck is higher than I expected in this format. And it is entirely on the back of Mox Opal just being Mox Opal, you know? And I think that this is, for a lot of people, and I think including you two, the best deck. Like, it is the best deck in the format. My group chat this weekend was wondering, is this it for, like, is this the last hurrah for Underworld Breach? And I'm kind of curious, Mason, your thoughts as somebody who has been a part of a lot of group chats about this deck. Like, is this it? Like, is this deck doomed for this modern world due to its consistency and strength?
Yeah, I think the deck is very powerful to start there. You know, like we could speculate about bannings or unbannings. I will say I think your friends have the correct line of like it's Breach, not Opal. Like currently, I do think Breach would get banned, not Opal, even though Opal is a, you know, one of the strongest it's such a strong Magic card, and you could argue stronger than Breach. But Breach is something that probably shouldn't be around in the first place, you know, and probably will get something else banned. And Opal's doing a lot of fair quote unquote stuff in other places, less broken, less uninteractive. So like give it a shot. But I do think the Breach deck, in my mind, is the deck to beat. It is doing the most powerful thing in the format. It's doing it one of the most consistently. There we go. Third time's the charm. Consistently. And then I think like the only deck really more so is Energy, which is like kind of like Zoo 2.0 of just like very cheap creatures that curve out well plus disruption. And so, like, you know, those decks are so consistent because they're so linear and the same. So, you know, it's one of the most consistent. It's one of the most powerful. And what it does is so hard to beat, even when you have like 7 or 8 sideboard cards. You know, going to this event, a lot of people had like 7 good cards for Breach, and Breach still put up a lot of really good results. And I had a lot of people on Monday message me who are in coaching that are like played Breach, and they're like, oh no, you know, this past weekend it was, you know, like Breach did so well, people are going to play more hate. And, you know, maybe that's true. My personal opinion is like, well, they got to prove it, you know, like how are they going to actually get those cards in their deck? Because they currently have 7 cards, where a lot of people have 7, you know, good ones. Is 8 and 9 really going to be the end of the world? You know, like how many can they play, still have cards for other matchups, and still function is a very real question in my mind. So when you ask me, like, is this the end of the line for Breach? Very realistic timeline, in my opinion, is, you know, Breach does get banned. We see what it's like, and maybe it gets unbanned someday. Maybe Opal leaves eventually. It comes back. Who knows? But I think for right now, yeah, Breach is sort of the thing to beat. And really quickly before I pass the mic here, I do want to say Boros had 39 points, Breach had 36. So Boros higher than Breach by 3 points or whatever. Of note, Boros had more than double the representation of Breach at these events. So there were more shots for Boros than Breach, and that especially matters when you think about the top 32 implications. And still, Breach was right there. It was still in the running for best deck, and maybe would have even been higher if we had used the old point system. So I think a big takeaway from this, really, in my mind, is people knew about Breach going to this weekend. It was not a secret. It was not some tight-lipped thing that only pros knew about, and all that sort of stuff. It was known. It came. It did really well, and people did not have good enough stuff to hate it. Maybe that stuff exists. Maybe we can all pay the Breach tax and keep it at bay. But it's very, very strong.
I think that's the problem, and I think you're kind of highlighting that that Breach tax doesn't exist, and there's a reason for it, in my opinion. And I'd be curious of your opinion. I just think that the fact that there's 5 different versions of this deck, and they all do well, and they all do something slightly different, and then you have to know what sideboard cards to bring in, and it's this fun fact, Abe? Did you know that your opponent also gets the sideboard? It's this crazy thing that happens in Magic, that Breach players also get to sideboard. And so it's do I want removal spells to stay in? Do I want Graveyard Hate? Do I want to interact on the stack? Do I want to interact with enchantments or artifacts? What do I want to interact with? And I just think that Mason mentions a Breach tax. I don't think it exists. I just think that it's one of those decks that can beat the hate.
That's interesting. I think I've had a pretty opposite experience playing Breach and watching watching streams of Breach, where I felt decks that present pressure and layers of threats, the layers of threats 1 or 2 pieces is pretty beatable in the long run, because, and it depends on what they are, but unless they fall in the right order, because of the general robust ability to interact that Breach has, because they have some counter magic to fight over things. They have they have their own removal spells. They have disenchants. They have counter magic. They really have a lot of tools to fight over this, and they're able to combo from no pieces in play, just a Breach, pretty effectively. And some builds even are able to do it with just Delirium and a Woodland, or having Savine's Reclamation, depending on how their deck's built. But there's a lot of resiliency naturally, which means you have to kind of close the door and lock it and deadbolt it and board it up a bit, and you have to layer on the things that are in the Breach player's way. If you do that, and that's where I'm not certain that I was kind of joking with Mason of what if I just played 10 different cards, all of which attacked a different facet of the Breach deck, and that way my Breach opponent couldn't know what they needed to answer, and also I'd make sure that whenever I'm drawing a piece of interaction for them, it's slowing down their game in a new way, and layering on enough of those different effects. Would that be an effective strategy? And I think it could be, and it'll be interesting to see how things continue to shape up, to see if Breach is still the best performing deck in terms of play and outcome, how that ratio plays for it. But I think there has to be a real acknowledgement by the field at this point, after this weekend, that there may be a Breach tax. It may be very high. You may have to kind of accept that you can't pay a really hefty Breach tax. And I think that one of the things about Boros that allows it to still be kind of this strong mid-range contender is that it has enough agnostically interactive cards for the kinds of things Breach is doing and can be built with the extra sideboard space because its game plan and its core pieces are strong enough on their own that you don't have to sideboard a lot of cards in and out all the time, that it can compete. And I think other decks can also find ways to play a bunch of different pieces and kind of layer on the hate if they so choose. And that could give them a good Breach plan even out of kind of the second tier of decks. I think that the issue is right now the second tier of decks aren't in a position to do that because they're not really built to do that, but it will be interesting, just like we saw Eldrazi do it, and I was saying earlier about Karn as kind of an innovation there as well. If we're sticking at Karn, that might just help our Breach matchup a good bit and be just kind of good enough to accelerate into. If other decks can adopt a similar philosophy of maybe I just need to play a couple more things that make it a little bit tougher so that I can enact my plan A and kind of get through Breach until I find that piece of interaction that really shuts them down, right? I'm able to exile their graveyard or find that counter spell to make sure they don't resolve a Breach or whatever it may be. But there's definitely just a lot to be done and a lot to say, but I think Breach is really strong and really resilient, but there's only so much it can do because while it has so much explosiveness, it doesn't have a lot of like ways to generate a ton of card advantage if it's being interacted with. It kind of needs to run away at a game state. I played a match earlier today where we were kind of playing at parity and I was playing Boros, and ultimately I stumbled first. They stuck an Emery and got to start drawing some cards with Bauble, and that is what really lost me the game, was that they got to draw like 3 or 4 cards off of just having this Emery before I was able to find an answer to it, and then they were up enough to combo me before I could close, right? They have every card in their deck advances them in some way, except for maybe just the mana sources, and that's really scary, but you can beat it with interaction in mass.
Mason, do you have an opinion on Grape Shot versus Thassa's Oracle?
Yeah, I mean, there's benefits to both. Grape Shot, for example, you can just like kind of value cast to kill some Ocelot Prides and friends, that's kind of cool. I am a pretty big believer in Oracle, and my biggest kind of reason is Oracle wins the game deterministically and fights through the things that stop it better than Grape Shot does. So what I mean by that is, and there aren't many things that can stop both of these things, but let's take an example of like you dress down me in response to my Oracle. Okay, I can sneak into super, bounce your dress down, bounce my Oracle using a spell bomb, or I can Unholy Heat it and replay it. And like you can, those kind of cards that stop the ETB on Oracle don't really work. You can Endurance me in response to Oracle trigger. I just mill my deck out again. I replay the card again, right? It's not that big a deal. Whereas like Grape Shot can actually be sometimes stopped by force of negation because it is so much, you have to actually like get to the storm count to win, and sometimes games break in weird ways, and you have to go like Grape Shot, which can be a good enough strategy a percentage of the time, but things like force negation actually can stop that. So that is all to say, I'm a big believer in Oracle kind of for those reasons. And this one is really a cherry on top of my ice cream sundae, if that makes sense. But people play things in real life because they like them in Modern, and they are somewhat kind of good, and they're typically underplayed and underexplored. And a good example of that in my mind is Heliod Combo. I think there are lots of decks you could put here in this category that do something that Grape Shot can't beat. And I think Heliod's a great example of this. We've seen Heliod consistently put up better results in paper than online, because online you need to actually gain enough life and hope that's enough to your opponent can't kill you. If you play, Grape Shot right now as your win condition, and you run into a Heliod player can be like, I gained 1 Googleplex of life, pass. And if they have more cards in deck than you, they can win, or they'll eventually assemble something that could win. And Eldrazi, Energy, and Breach with Grape Shot and Orzhov cannot beat that. Most of the decks we're talking about today cannot beat a Googleplex of life. It is not a number you can reach. And so,
while that might sound like a pitcher Heliod, it's not really, but it's more of an example of people do things like this that are powerful, not consistently great, and sometimes weird on Magic Online or just underplayed because maybe we as a community haven't embraced as much as we should. And Oracle beats a lot of that noise. Also, I just think Oracle's also pretty good against the Ocelot Pride draws. You know, Abe, if I'm on the play and you play your Pride, right? And then like I could Grape Shot, that's pretty good. Also, I can just play my Oracle, look at my top two, probably put them both on bottom, you know, and move on and just block. What are you going to do? Static Prison me? I'll get rid of it when I combo, you know? Like you can't really exile the card for forever. And I think that like, you know, sometimes, and I've played plenty of games where I just get in the board and it like deters combat for a few turns. And that is reasonable. And then I eventually just kill it and bring it back and I win. So long-winded way of saying I really like Oracle because of the cleanness. I understand the Grape Shot. I think we're really splitting hairs at the end of the day, but that's my reasoning for the way I've split my hairs. I don't know how y'all feel about it.
I also kind of just like, because your deck is very good at producing blue mana in a lot of your combo draws, there can be some like weird low resource situations, especially playing through Hate, where it can get hard to assemble like enough red mana to, if you do have to cast Grape Shot multiple times. Yeah, like it's not, especially in post board games, like if your opponent has like a Nihil Spellbomb or a Soul Guide Lantern or something, like it's not impossible to imagine that you maybe have trouble assembling everything to do it that way. But if you have like Mox Amber almost always taps for blue, like occasionally taps for green, or like you're rumbling multiple times to get through things, and so you're kind of like floating in amber as your only thing if you don't have opals, or maybe your opals get surgical. Like there are things that you kind of create downstream issues when you take the words win the game off of your win condition. And that's why, like, even if you're playing an additional win condition out of the sideboard for the same purpose, like I've liked seeing the Jace. I've liked the look of that.
Yeah. I do think that I basically just agree with both of you. I think that one of the things that I talked about with Matt, who's a big believer in this deck, is that because you're not playing Ragavan anymore, your mana requirements like matter quite a bit, and thus playing the things that fit you the best is probably better. So, should we talk about Boros really quick?
Yeah, I mean, what there's a lot that could be said. What's
this is a deck that I think everyone believes they have a good matchup against, otherwise they wouldn't register their deck for a Modern tournament, right? And I think that it's one of those decks that's like, you can have a good matchup, but sometimes you're on the draw and you just lose. Like it is too much to overcome. I think Mason, I don't remember if it was you, but somebody was like, I think that the Guide of Souls deck will just be good regardless of what they ban out of this deck. And it's evidently true, but funnily enough, to me, like the best card in this deck is now Ocelot Pride. In my opinion, like a pretty big margin. And it takes over the game in weird ways, like that you don't expect the number of permanents to be happening, you don't expect the life to be happening, you don't expect how it's going to interact, and I don't know, it just always does. I've been really impressed. There was a point where I was pretty locked into playing Boros for the RC because I just think that it is like a very consistent, aggressive deck that can play a very good long game and mid-range game plan that typically leads to a deck being like one of the best decks in Modern historically. And I don't think that the One Ring changed that. Like we did see something really interesting in the Canadian RC with people boarding in Showdown of the Skulls in the Mirror. That is not how I would board in the Mirror, and I was kind of wanting to talk about that. Mason, you actually did coverage of this, and I wanted your opinion on both the deck and kind of like its many different approaches to sideboarding.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of different ways you can go about it. I said it earlier. It's kind of like the new age zoo deck. I think another way to look at it is like new age Jund, where you're trying to present clock plus like interaction to like clear the way. And I think that is a very powerful thing. To answer your question about shutdown the Scald, I think it makes sense. If you think what matters in the matchup are the cards Flage, Guide of Soul, and Ajani, the card does a good job of finding those and overpowering them. And the games do stall out a bit. And especially if you bring in Wrath of the Skies for the mirror, it can be a good way to like refuel as games often board stall. Board stalls can be broken, with like Pride plus Guide of Souls, for example. Something like that can break it, or a Flip to Johnny, or the Flage, like we talked about. But I think having some way to have cards in the mirror is good. I don't know if I would play the card Showdown of the Scalds to fix it, but it has some real merit to it. And I think, one of the things we saw is like, yeah, the player who stuck Showdown of the Scalds was able to like buff their battlefield and kind of play a bit more disrespectfully, you could argue, by just sort of shoving their lead and putting the opponent in like a you must get out of this situation. And I think that's something that can be very valuable. So I understand it. I actually don't. My biggest complaint with it is I don't know where else I want it. Like I think like you play against Orzhov, it's pretty good there. You play against Jund Sagavan, like someone who likes that kind of deck, it's good there. But for the most of the top decks, don't worry about in Modern. I think it's actually not very strong. So I think that's it. I think one of the big good things about the Boros Energy deck too is like it can have a pretty good sideboard, and I think in Modern we have not had a Boros mid-range deck before. Boros has been the burn color, and the Aspiring Spike, I have this cool new Blood Sun Brew. And that was kind of all the deck ever really was, outside of, fringe moments in history that are kind of blips in time. And we've learned from having reasons to be a more, mid-rangey, grindier deck that you can have a lot of really solid cards in here. And also it's really easy to splash a third color. We saw people play Mardu for discard spells during the combo days. We've seen some players pick up, blue for Consign to Memory and things like Mockingbird and Expressive Iteration. It's not that hard to have that little splash. And, with all the fetch lands and everything, you can go a long way. So I think there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And that's one of the appealing parts of this deck. Your fail rate's so low, your consistency is so high, and you have access to a good amount of cards that can solve problems. So, that's kind of my thoughts on Energy. I don't know if that answers all of your questions. Were there something Abe wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Energy is just in a very solid position for a lot of the reasons you listed. As far as like the minutia of the deck, I mean, it's a pretty tight, like first 70 or like maybe 65 cards in the 75. You don't see a lot of change those because that core is so strong. I do have some opinions based on my testing of like after listening to Grindcast, where Bob and Cheese was talking about Conduit Goblin as something he saw from a 5-0 decklist dump that he played in a tournament that he won recently. And liking that. I've tried it myself and actually thought it's pretty good. I'm not really a huge believer in Philia, and so I think it's something to try. I've also really liked the idea of Thalia, though I haven't played it much at all yet, especially in a world where we're seeing more Eldrazi and more Breach likely to show up. I think Thalia gets a little bit better because that extra 1 mana can mean a lot. And even in the mirror in game 1, I mean, there's like fables and like goblin bombardments and rules. I think I don't have to explain to you, Spencer, how much Thalia can change the texture of a game. I know you have a real vendetta against Thalia, but yeah, I think that is like, as much as it's kind of two-sided in the mirror match, and it feels weird to say it could be good. I do think that if you're the one who's controlling if it's added to the game or not, there are a lot of games you'll catch your opponent stumbling and stuck on like 2 or 3 mana and not able to do multiple things in a turn, and it can snowball. And I think it's just right when I'm talking about one more speed bump or 1 or 2 more speed bumps for Breach as really the answer to kind of layer hate. That's something that does prevent them from comboing effectively so long as it's in play, and forces them to cast 1 more removal spell, and not just 1 more removal spell, but 1 more removal spell for 2 mana and not just 1. So there's a few things there, and a few things in like terms of the sideboard of like, I think you're right on the money about Showdown, of it being something that maybe like 4 is a lot, but having like some number of them to kind of grind a little bit can be good. The mirrors are kind of interesting. I could talk about that for a bit, but I think just for the purpose of what we're talking about today in the power rankings, it's pretty much covered.
I'll give one piece of advice. This, like I said, I'm not playing it for Portland, but it was on my list. And the number of arguments that I got into people, they're like, I can't believe that you're playing Stony Silence. Like, that, like, there has to be better stuff. The best performing Boros decks, I believe, all played Stony Silence. So I'm going to toot my own horn here and say,
yeah, it's the best card against Breach. What do you do? Hey, if you're one of those people from Spencer, what do you want? It's a 2-mana thing that interacts on a different axis.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. Don't let those haters of Stony Silence into your life, and just know that you should play it.
Yeah, really looking for the 1-mana Stony Silence. And the Image 3 Brain Rot really taking over.
Do we want to talk? We kind of talked about Titans nut draws quite a bit, but do we want to talk about? I guess I want to talk about something. I was surprised at the level of surprise people had for this deck. Like,
what deck are you talking about?
Temur Eldrazi. I'm not sure I understand why people didn't see it as like a top 3 deck. It consistently had results leading up to this, and they're like, I guess we have to play 4 Charmaz now on the internets, and I'm like, okay, but like, what were you missing? Like, what are you talking about? And I don't know, like, I get that people think that ramp decks are like big mana decks are brain dead stupid, but like, the reason that I hate this deck has nothing to do with that. I don't know. I wanted like, am I in the weirdest circle in Magic where people did not know that this was going to happen this weekend?
I don't know. I think that a lot of people, I played the deck a little bit to try to get a feel for it, and it wasn't my cup of tea because while it does have everything, I think, to cover the format, like all of the cards are there, it's a little bit disjointed sometimes, and you're kind of relying on having a pretty strong open in a lot of your games. And so if you have that experience, like, a few times, and you're like, I don't get it, and also I do want to circle back to it, mentioned a couple times, but adding Karn over the like last week or two before this round of RCs, I think did change a lot of the texture of the deck and of the matchups. And so, like, if you weren't in tune with that, which I think a lot of people maybe aren't in tune with the kind of minutia of that, they say, oh, it's Eldrazi, if you weren't in tune with that, then maybe you didn't know. But
yeah, that's fair.
But I think the deck is just pretty strong and pretty good.
It was putting up results before Karn. For what it's worth, 100% of the points, 100% of them had Karn. So like that Karn change that happened 2 weeks ago, 100% of the decks opted for it.
Yeah, but without Karn, I mean, what do you think your Breach matchup is like?
It was horrible. I played it.
Exactly. So if you think about it like that, I mean, if you didn't realize that Karn was like changing that much the texture of the matchup, or you think that maybe it's still just the same, or you didn't realize Karn wasn't in the deck in the first place, I can see that being surprising.
Okay. Yeah, I also think that there's a common Magic players are really dumb. There's this common trend where if there's a card that you can point to that like hard counters your deck but doesn't win the game, people will avoid it. I think Breach has this with Stony Silence, where people are like, I don't want to play a deck that like loses to Stony or whatever. Only through time have they learned. And I think Consigned Memory is that for Eldrazi. We were like, yeah, but can you ever beat a Consign? And it's like, yeah, I mean, Consign's really good, and it's gonna like sometimes stop me, but it's not an unbeatable Magic card,
right?
Like it is really good, and I think part of this too might be like the over-indexing of how good blue-black is. Like I mentioned, like I thought it was a bit better against the deck than it turned out to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, if you're under the opinion of like, well, Breach goes super underneath them and beats them unless they draw a card and they play Consign, and the blue-black deck just kind of stomps on them because they play Consign and Force, and that hits basically all their good threats with cheap threats. Okay, and then they beat the energy deck, but also sometimes energy's on the play and they stumble a little. So like if you do those things, it's like, yeah, it's good, but man, I don't want to worry about it too much.
So why didn't it play out that way though?
But that's what I'm getting to.
Oh.
But those players innovate. People are wrong about blue-black, and like I just said, Magic players are dumb. You like one consign is not going to beat you. Like it is not game over if you just get consigned one time. If I counter your spell one time and you're playing another deck, how often are you like, gosh darn it, you really got me, Mason,
Sure.
And you just like pick up your cards and go home. You need to have more, and if you don't, these decks will beat you. And these players they realized these things, they just didn't give up and kept going. So
I think we talked about all the top decks. Mason, what would you play?
I would play Breach. I mean, I've been saying it for months now. Not months, but like since basically, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I kind of like the proof was in the pudding. I actually remember someone from coaching,
like December 18th or 16th when the ban announcement was.
Yeah, I remember right before the spotlight, someone I coach was like, "Hey, I'm going to France for a couple weeks, sick brag, and I'm not gonna have as much time to practice for the RC because of that. So I want to pick a deck now." And I was like, "I'm telling you, my gut says to play Breach. You've played a lot of energy. Worst comes to worst, you switch to that at the end of the day." And he was like, "Well, there hasn't been much results on it yet, And I was like, "Don't worry about it. Trust me. We're still figuring stuff out. But like, if you want to put the most effective time in, you should play Breach." And I swear, the day he took off for France was the first day of a bunch in a row that Nathan the Guilt Leaf just top 8'd every challenge for like a week straight and just was like chain top 8s. And it was really funny to just like talk to them later and be like, yes, I don't think the deck hasn't top 8'd, since you left for France. Let's get up to speed now. But I'm a big believer. I could talk ad nauseum. I think you should play the deck. I think you should put time into it. If you're going to Portland and Charlotte, and maybe you're a little anxious to play in Portland, I implore you to start practicing it for Charlotte. I think it will be so good. I think if you're stuck between two decks, you should play the better deck, and you should play Breach. That is my opinion. There are lots of great decks, but this is the deck to beat.
Yep.
Yeah, I am in agreement with Mason that playing Breach is, I think, the best thing to do. Personally, there's part of me that might still play Boros if I'm not feeling super comfortable playing Breach. Especially with just the Moto lag issues. I've been putting a lot more time and energy because it can't hurt for me to get those reps in to kind of see the format, but also it's kind of been a better use of my time to do that. And so if I don't wind up getting the time in before Charlotte or before Portland, it's definitely like top of my list for Charlotte to play as well. But that's I think it's hard to argue with that deck's results.
I agree. I have a dedicated testing session this weekend. So I'm just gonna feel like I could play something else. I currently am planning to register Eldrazi. But that is actually for part of the reason that Eve just mentioned. The Moto lag issues have been really hard for testing for me, and as like a dad of 2 kids and a full-time job and stuff, it is most of my testing, and I have not gotten the reps that I wanted for this RC. It's sad. I have really good plans. I think my deck lists are good for Eldrazi. I would say this. I think that I was supposed to have a Breach like boot camp day that we didn't end up doing because Moto lag was too bad that day, and I probably would have ended up on Breach had I done it. Additionally, there are some card availability issues for me that had prevented me from playing Amulet. And I think that, like, both Breach and Amulet have this, like, stigma around them that they don't deserve, that they're, like, too hard to learn, too much of a time investment. And I just don't think that's true. Like, I don't think it would take you more than the amount of reps that you have for any given event to play either of these decks efficiently. And I think that the fact that Amulet did well with so little representation, because let's be honest, like, we didn't talk about this in the show, but like the new version is nonsensical. Like, you look at these versions, and if you're not, like, we went from the easiest version of Amulet ever in history not that long ago to whatever this one is. And it's like, I don't even know what's happening.
Well, it's literally super easier now.
You think so?
Yeah, it's easier once you know it, because it's just
right.
All
okay,
charts.
So this is my point.
But like it's so
this
easy
is my.
to learn.
You're actually talking about my point, though.
yeah. I am helping your point.
I'm just saying, if I spent 2 days, not even 2 days, it'd probably take me 2 hours.
No, I think you just have to I think if Dom Harvey wrote a step-by-step,
he does. He actually updated the guide before this RC.
Yeah, I think if you did that and you held the cards in your hand and you walked through doing it,
exactly,
and then you practice doing that for like 20 minutes a day, you would get there pretty easily. The hard part would be figuring out first the hate. But I'm with you. I'm backing you up.
Okay. All right. Cool. Yeah, I agree.
I think if you could figure out the mono green loop, then you can.
That's my point. As I don't understand why Breach and Titan get this like level of like, this is impossible. I'll never learn this. It's like, well, are you for real? Like, have you played a deck before?
It's different to play through hate. I think it's very valid to be and I think a lot of people, especially they don't play a lot of combo, get afraid.
Yeah. I think playing through hate's the hard part, but the executing the loop is very easy.
Yeah. So my point is
actually harder to commentate.
I'm currently playing Older RC in Portland, and I won't pretend that I'm playing something else. I believe, and being honest about it, I think that if you registered Breach or Titan for Portland, you are probably registering the best deck for the event. And I don't want to pretend that I don't know that going into this. So yeah. That's it. That's all I want. I don't get it. I don't get why we think Mason's out here saying Magic players are dumb. I'm saying you guys are all really smart. I promise you can figure it out.
No, I think they're just people are lazy and they love buyouts. I mean, I'll just say on the episode, whatever. This is the episode heel turn, where it's just like I think a lot of what happens is it'd be a lot of work, and I'd rather play League of Legends, which, hey, don't get me wrong, brother, I'm with you.
You can play Boros. It's so much easier than learning.
Yeah, and it's not like Boros is a bad deck. Like, I think Boros is a very good deck, and there are lots of things that you could be doing instead of playing Breach. And I think, for some people, there is a lot to learn, and they just don't have the time, and they have, let's say 5 hours a week, and it's not even all at once. It's separated over the things, and it's daunting and it's a lot of stuff. And for those people, I understand what they're saying. It's the people who I watch play 2 to 3 Moto Leagues a day and are like, It'd be a lot of work. And I'm like, yeah, this 30-second league of Demir midrange and standard for this week really was needed. Like it really.
You never fit count ain't big enough for both me playing my standard leagues and doing something new.
I gotta decide to get Mythic, by the way, if I'm going to do it tomorrow. And it will really cut into my time. But I feel like that one's really true. So. Should we talk about the Patreon? You can go to patreon.com/CMTG, become a patron of $5 more. You get access to the Patreon question. And Nick asks, what are some less popular streamers you watch to learn? This is interesting. Because I don't actually know who the popular streamers are. And this is going to sound so bad from like a mostly arena gamer, but I almost exclusively watch MTGO streams. Today I watched Young Dingo while I was working for like 4 hours. as he was in the Modern Challenge with Orzhov in Modern. And then I went and watched Andrea Mengucci's Orzhov video because what is funny about this?
It just is like, what's some lesser known people? And then you're like, Andrea Mengucci, number 2. I understand.
I don't know who I don't even know. It just. Here's the thing.
I'm going to give you a hint. It's not Mengucci.
Well, okay.
I didn't know that. It's just funny.
I did watch Young Dingo for 4 hours. Which, you're like the thing is to me, is like I know who, like I've played against Young Dingo like I don't know how many times at this point, like a lot. So like to me, is this? Do you not know who this is? Like I don't know. I don't know what the listener doesn't know on this.
Where's the line?
Yeah, like
I think here's a good line. MTGO streamers with more than 3-digit viewers all the time are probably pretty big because they're like.
Okay, so Young Dingo is a popular streamer.
I would argue Undingo is one of the most popular Magic streamers. He consistently holds pretty good viewership, well liked in the community, nice guy, plays brews and stock decks, and like just puts in 8 hours a day.
I don't do this. I don't watch. The thing is I'm looking to watch people that I'm gonna play against in a challenge when I play it or in a league when I play it. So I don't do this. Is this like a weakness of mine, Mason?
No, I don't watch barely any streamers now. You know what I mean? But I think this question is a little bit hard. I think the best answer I could give is Meatman, who is a content creator who does almost exclusively YOG when it comes to Modern. He's kind of a guy, I would actually say he's a lot like me, where he makes silly posts and then grinds, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So he makes a lot of TikToks. That's how I found him. If you've seen, he's the guy that does like the inside WotC HQ and then like hard cuts back and forth where he's playing multiple people in WotC and being like, some absurd thing that happened, like, yeah, the yellow border that looks like urine, that's going to sell so well, It's like, put on all the cards and stuff like that. Like, he's that guy. But he also just is like a solid, I would argue he's like a really good YOG player. And I've watched a lot of his stuff when I was playing YOG and learning. But it's just kind of hard to find smaller streamers or lesser known ones because often they aren't, if they're at that stage, they haven't hit the full time, which means they're streaming at miscellaneous random times, which makes it hard to find them and get like really invested. That can happen, like every big streamer starts that way. But I don't have many good suggestions for you listeners, unfortunately, because it's hard for me to find them with my current work schedule.
And it's not
so it ends up watching the known people.
It's not like we don't do it. Like we had System Magic's Greg on for episode 501 like a year ago before their stream blew up. Like we did this.
I'd even say like compared to like in my mind, the big MTGO streamers are like Newmont, Caleb,
Spike,
Dingo, Spike.
I just said the big one. I'm the worst.
I think that Ginger is around like he's like if you're watching Misplaced Ginger plays 4 challenges a day, then like you have to be a certain level of like entrenched to enjoy that. And then anyone who was ever in the MPL doesn't count. Like they're bigger in Magic than life. So like great. Their stream if it's on to watch. But really like it is hard to discover new content creators. I think that in general, like I watch a lot of late night content. Like I'll watch sometimes I can just fall asleep with these streams on of like Joint Exploration I've talked about on the stream. That's CFT Sock and Jason Yee. 2 of I think the most impressive deck builders and innovators of art.
That's a great answer. I think they're huge in Magic, so I didn't really think of them.
Yeah, but I mean they frequently get less than they have frequently less than like 20 viewers until they get like other people wrapping up for the day and rating them.
But that's
sometimes it's hit or miss. Like sometimes they'll just play like Jeskai Mutate in Modern for like 4 days, and you feel like you're not going to learn anything by watching. And sometimes they're like half between Arena and half between Moto, so it can depend on the night. But what I will do is if there's not anything on I want to watch and I do feel like I want to consume, like look out there, like I actually just have followed on Twitch the Magic directory. So that when I go to my follow page, I can just click to games and then see who's live. And it is a bit of that directory has people playing Commander and people playing, Arena Cube and people building Commander decks and like it's like it has everything. So it's kind of hit or miss. But if there's someone playing something I want to watch, I think it was over the pandemic, Mason, that you and I did this where we were just like scrolling through things and like, you can just find some streams, people playing Magic and watch and observe. And I think that
I do want to say
kind of do a little bit of discovery.
It does look like at the time of recording, the top stream is Young Dingo, so I look like a total moron for this question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mason.
It's actually Caleb. You probably just don't follow him.
Yeah, that's probably true. Actually, it's real. So I held it in the laugh when you said Dingo, but when you said Mengucci, it was just like it's.
No. So the Mengucci one was on YouTube. It wasn't even a streamer. But I do want to give a shout out to
Mengucci streams. He's going live in like 2 hours from now. That's when he goes live. Sometimes I watch him.
I'm gonna be in bed. I do want to give a shout out to Jaffer. They almost exclusively stream Arena, but they also do like events. They do like cross promotions with people. He did a cross promotion with my co-host of the Need to Nerd podcast where they talked about decks and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think that type of stuff is cool. Like when you like bring somebody up, I'm like a big fan of that. So you can check out our sponsors, Untapped.gg. I got some numbers recently. I'm waiting to cash out on this one, guys. But I do know that Abe, whatever you said 2 weeks ago and demanded that people did help out. So thank you to that. Or 3 weeks ago now? I don't know. Untapped.gg is the best Arena deck tracker by a lot. It is still standard season for a little while. If you're looking to up your standard game, it is the best way to do that. And we recommend it. There's a link in the show notes for that. And then the swag store. I know 10 of you bought something in the last little while, and I appreciate it. I don't know what you bought because everything's broken, and I'm not gonna pretend like I know what you bought. I don't know what
you bought something on the swag store.
Yeah, thank
you. What you can do. Comment on YouTube.
Yeah, let us know. What did you buy? What did you buy? Because it's broken, so I can't see. I was like, oh man, I want to shout out like what all these people are buying. We can't do that because it's so broken. But you can still buy it, and we still get the monies. We have everything priced the lowest we can. We make $1 off of every product. We're trying to make it as cheap as possible for each of you and all of you. And thank you so much to those because I know that it is us plugging this that's doing it. It's available. If you're watching on YouTube, it's actually just right in the YouTube stuff. If you're listening, it is a link in your show notes right now. Abe, the show is about improving. We're always trying to get better today than we were yesterday. What was your always improving moment this week?
Yeah, my always improving moment this week came from an Innistrad remastered sealed RCQ that I played over the weekend. For a couple of plays that I made where I really just slowed down and evaluated the context of the game. Especially when my opponent made plays that I wasn't really expecting. So I'll give an example. I had an opponent with Shrill Howler, which is a creature that like transforms for 6 mana. Once it's transformed, it starts attacking and making 3/2s. And we're kind of like at the start of the game that was going to drag out in a couple ways. It was turn 5. My opponent casts Aim High to give it +2/+2, and then attack to get it past my Tireless Tracker, which I just played. And I sat and thought about it for a bit because the Tireless Tracker is obviously better than the Shrill Howler as a card. But like looking at the context of the game, my opponent had 1 card in hand and had just spent it or had just spent a card to pump the Shrill Howler and attack because they didn't want it to die. So I kind of got this read on their hand that they probably did just have a land, and if I used the combat trick in my hand to trade off my Tireless Tracker and just say it was good enough being up 2 clues on this creature for me to like leverage the rest of my advantage and win the game, that I will, that I could do that. And that was exactly what happened. Like I cast my spell, pumped my creature so it could block, traded off the tracker, which on like at surface looks bad, but taking the time to evaluate the context of the game was something that I made sure to do rather than kind of playing on autopilot. And the same thing with like sideboarding and changing the texture of my deck. I kind of had 2 decks switching between in the Swiss, and just kind of evaluating when my first deck was better than my second deck and when it wasn't, depending on how my opponent's deck was configured. So really just thinking about the game holistically, and then also kind of looking at the micro too. So those are a couple things I was proud of this week.
Yeah, just a shout out to the Patreon Discord really quick. If you become a patron of $5 or more, you get access to that. But one of the things that I said is like, what is the tactics that you've learned in Magic that have helped you? And I just want to call it like, that was very good tactical play by you over like overarching. Like, you made a tactical play that maybe doesn't strategically make sense, but in context, which is a tactical thing, was really important. And I love that. Like, that is one of the Nick, who had our Patreon question this week, actually talked about making people have it, which is a tactical maneuver in the game, and I think that you executed it well. And it is one of the reasons that limited is so valuable, is that it makes you question your strategy versus your tactics very often due to your card quality. So I will go next. I looked at every single Eldrazi ramp deck between the 3 events this week. Mason often talks about, like, is your time more valuable playing your 30th league versus studying or VOD reviews or whatever you're going to do? And I put together a list of every single non-stock card between, it was really Gruul and Teamer, because I don't think that it has any value at all, and I really, really hope that people don't play it. But I think, yeah, I looked at every list, put together a list to put in the Discord, and just really trying to understand, like, what am I trying to do with this deck, and what am I trying to execute, and taking the time to do research rather than play games, because there's only so much you can learn from playing, whereas putting pen to paper actually, I think, helps in different ways. So, what about you, Mason?
Yeah, mine was just giving myself a pass to check out. I commentated every round, but I think 2 of the Canadian RC over the weekend. And that is just like a lot of not only work, but like magic after working the whole week previously, 8 hours a day or whatever, and preparing for stuff like that. And my like default reaction was to like, okay, I'm done with coverage, eat. All right, let's go watch and learn from the European RC. Let me go look over these deck lists. Let me start doing stuff. And I just had a moment of like, wait, I should just chill. Like, I've worked all this time. I'm going to be busy for the next 2 weeks and weekends in a row. I should just take like tonight. I can do this tomorrow. It will not be the end of the world to like let myself have, another hour or 2 of relaxation and not just immediately start working again. Where my default is just like, don't stop working, get everything done, and stay on top of things. And so it was nice. And I think it's important too to understand, like, you should put in hours and work and grind. I think that's really important. But sometimes you're just going to be too exhausted where you've done enough and it's okay to like give yourself a little bit of a pass, chillax, and then hit it hard the next day. So that was my always improving moment.
I love that. That's something I talked about in the Patreon Discord. Segue this week of like, dude, sometimes you just gotta stop. I really like that you had the moment of self-reflection. Did you open like a page too, where you like opening the page and you're like, wait a second?
No, it was more just like, kind of dreading the idea or whatever.
Sure.
And just being like, I've got to get this done, whatever, da-da-da, and just being like, do I actually, right? Like, I already put in so much work. Do I really need to, like, work for, the 12th hour today or whatever on this and all these things, And,
or should I spend the first hour in the Rift?
Exactly. Or, like, watching Severance is what I ended up, And also, the funny part of the story I don't tell is then I had a really good idea for sewers, worked on a cyborg guide for 45 minutes, so figuring out the top 5 matchups.
You did do magic work.
But that was at 1 a.m., so it was the next day.
So it doesn't count.
I said hit the ground hard the next day.
Well, just like in Severance, your job brain unplugged.
If you want to see Mason's smart 1 a.m. ideas, head over to patreon.com/CSMG, join the Patreon Discord. This is join the public Discord where we talk about sports, anime, stuff like that. Those links are both in the show notes. And then the YouTube comments, Abe, you let him slip. It was your fault. I don't know why it's your fault, but I'm going to blame you.
All right, guys. You know what to do. Tell them it's Spencer's fault.
Everybody put Spencer's fault on this episode.
Spencer's fault.
Dude, it's funny. We had 8 comments like 3 episodes ago and skyrocketed in views. Like, they are so important. They mean the world to us.
Yeah, it really does make it.
It's crazy how much they mean. And we read them all. We post them all. We share them with each other. So check it out. You can follow us on Twitter at CCMTG as well as on Blue Sky at CCMTG. Mason, where can people find you if they want like coaching or just, your memes? Where can they do that?
Yeah, so you can follow me on social media on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. If you want to get coaching, you can reach out to me via that same website or my email, masoniclark@gmail.com. Put coaching in the description. That way I know what you're coming for. You can find me on twitch.tv/TheMasonClark from time to time when I have things to do there. And then you will be able to watch me on the NRG coverage this weekend for, I believe, both Modern and the team event. And then I will also be doing coverage live from the RC in Portland. So make sure to tune in to watch that. It's going to be a great weekend of Magic. I can't wait to get to do that live and in charge. Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
You can find me over on Twitter and Blue Sky at More Nothings. I'm not going to have any coaching available between now and Portland, but I will have a couple spots opening up between Portland and Charlotte. So please feel free to DM me another platform about that. How about you, Spencer?
Yeah, I also don't have any coaching available for Portland. Apparently 2 people is enough for me. But I will have some open up for Charlotte as I'm not going. And I'm happy to help there. You can follow me on Blue Sky. Message me there. Huge shout out to Mason. I don't think I said this on the podcast. For letting me know that my DMs were closed. So thank you, Mason. And yeah, Blue Sky is probably like my #1 social media app now. But I also do another podcast called Need to Nerd, podcast about nerd culture and video games, anime, stuff like that. Check it out; it's really fun. It's like a labor of love at this point. Like, it's not every week; it's probably like twice a month, and we have a lot of fun. And then check me out here on this YouTube channel every week, except for maybe this week, just due to time constraints and stuff for Constructed Clash. Powered by Constructive Criticism. We really appreciate it, and we've gotten a really great feedback this year as we've made sure to do it every week, and it means the world. Thank you everybody so much for listening, and we'll see you all next week with a brand new episode of Constructed Criticism.
Magic, magic, magic.